Show 10 of NBC Saturday Night saw the introduction of one of the show's most beloved early hosts, writer and character actor Buck Henry. Lauren says, Buck Henry came in to host and taught me a whole other level of things. Buck so totally got it. When he got there, he said, "Do you want to do the samurai again?" And we'd never even thought of repeating things until that moment. For his part, it took Buck a few days with the writers to understand this new school of comedy. He says, "On the first show I hosted, I made a suggestion for an ending for a sketch because I came up in the school that says you end a sketch with an ending. And I heard one of the writers behind me say to the others, 1945, and I nodded inwardly. I see, I get it. It was considered really corny to go for a joke. They thought somehow it was like Carol Burnett." Before long, though, it was as if he was a part of the group, a privilege and trust not given to very many hosts. Henry always made it a point to arrive from LA a few days early for his gigs, just to hang out on the 17th floor. He often just read the New York Times and watched in wonder as the manic energy took shape to form the week's material. Buck Henry was a master of deadpan delivery, the art of saying an absurd or outlandish thing as if it was a straightforward and simple matter of fact. See also Leslie Nielsen. He got his start as an improvisational comedian and writer. One of his earliest recurring characters was the president of an organization dedicated to clothing naked animals to preserve their modesty, a role he played with utter sincerity in numerous talk shows and interviews. He took pride in never letting on that the whole thing was a gag. As a writer, he'd worked with Mel Brooks on Get Smart and as co-author of the screenplays for The Graduate and Catch-22. As an actor, however, he was not widely known in 1976. This anonymity worked in his favor on SNL, though, as it meant he could portray any role written for him without his own celebrity getting in the way of the character. He was more than willing to take on sketches other hosts balked at, and his willingness to trust himself to the writers made him a comforting presence for many on the 17th floor. He became the customary last host of the season and hosted a total of 10 times in the first 5 years of the show. Buck's first monologue is a good introduction to the type of host he'd be. He makes a straightforward plea to the audience to embrace him even though he's not a celebrity, completely sincere of course, while a long list of the celebrities they wish they'd gotten to host that week scroll past him. They range from pop idols to historical and mythic figures, but I guess we have to settle for old Buck. I'm alright with that. Bill Withers performs a very 70s-sounding rendition of his classic Ain't No Sunshine with horns and a band in lieu of strings. It's really tight. Withers doesn't seem like he particularly cares about looking cool or being flashy on stage. He holds an acoustic guitar but barely plays it and closes his eyes for a significant portion of the song, but he still nails the vocal. I love this version of the track. I've always felt the string arrangement on the studio version kind of strangles the song, and although they're hardly subtle, I feel like these instruments fit the material better. Withers had put out his first album on Columbia the year prior, but it hadn't produced any hit singles, thus a performance of perhaps his best-known song here. The 10 years with Columbia were not particularly happy for him, and he largely retired from the industry in 1985 at the end of his contract. Regardless, he's widely seen as one of the most important early R&B writer-performers. Not bad, as Withers said, for a guy from Slab Fork, West Virginia. Buck Henry introduces cabaret artist Toni Basil as inimitable, meaning not able to be imitated or unique. She's certainly that. This is technically Basil's second performance. She appeared as part of dance troupe The Lockers earlier in the season. However, the focus is strictly on her for this number, in which she scats and bebops her way up and down the stairs and all over the stage like a woman literally possessed by jazz. Her rapid-fire vocalizations and technical yet somewhat bawdy choreography evoke an era bygone even in 1976, but especially so today. I can't look away from her, frankly. She's something else. I like to imagine this bee stung Elroy and Jake's mom, and that's where the Blues Brothers got their superpowers. My insane non-canon theories aside, this is just a silly, punny excuse for Belushi to sing the blues, and he's good at it. We'll discuss his musical prowess more later on when the brothers make their first proper appearance, but I think he could have honestly had a career as a frontman for a rock band. I mean, he lived like a rock star anyway, why not do the music part too? When I heard Don Pardo introduce impressionist Michael O'Donoghue, I knew we were in for trouble. This is a bit for which Mike had become well known at the Harvard Lampoon, but seeing his admittedly accurate impression of talk show host Mike Douglas getting 12-inch spikes jammed into his eyes on national television would have been quite the spectacle in 1976. Props to O'Donoghue really selling the impression. There's absolutely nothing slapstick about the way he plays the pain old Mike Douglas is in here, and it's freaking gruesome. The phone cold open is toned down slightly from last week, but they couldn't have really topped themselves and gotten away with it. I'm Chevy and You're Not has become I'm Chevy and I Love You All Very Deeply. I guess that's what they get for not laughing last week. In current events, doctors have discovered white mice cause cancer. That's why the research took so long, hardy har har. Kissinger will try to negotiate a settlement between the Steelers and the Cowboys at the Super Bowl in Miami. He's also traveling to Spain to visit General Franco, who is still seriously dead. And finally, the body of the recently deceased Chinese premier was
ceremoniously placed on a bed of rice and smothered with Oriental spices.
Mugu Guy dead? Really? For the death of the Chinese premier? Wow, guys. Just wow. We have a weird gag about Tony Orlando and Freddie Prinze Sr. being conjoined twins. I can't say I really get the joke, but the two do look a little alike, I guess. They finally got through to Angola, not Angelo's Pizza, this week. Garrett is a perplexed janitor informing Chevy that he's called too early to speak to the correspondent. Perplexed janitor is sadly one of the better roles they've given Garrett in a few weeks. More dope humor. Did you know squirrels on weed play with their nuts rather than store them? Did Lorraine get a haircut? It looks like it in this ad for Roll-On House Deodorant. This is another parody ad which nails the look and feel of a 70s advertisement, but isn't actually funny beyond looking reasonably like the real thing. Honestly, that's most of them if you're asking me. Buck Henry does an editorial reply as the vice president of the Association for Fatuous Pedants. Chevy mocks him while he rails against masturbation and homosexuality on behalf of the Pope. Buck's a perfect straight man here. I can see why the cast loved him so much, and I look forward to all of his other shows. Lastly, they got Alan Zweibel to do News for the Dead as the outro. It's certainly a departure from previous weeks, and always neat to see the writers appear on camera. This week is the last week before they'd start ditching them. Yay! That's the good news. The bad news is they get a fucking dildo in this one, and I'm out. Again. Sorry, but you can watch this garbage if you care to see how it turns out for them, you sicko. Who's the funniest person in Irvington, New York? Buck Henry asks everybody in town who it is, then asks them who it is. Turns out it's Marie, who's so supremely confident in her funniness that she feels in no way compelled to demonstrate it to us. End of skit. Christ. This is Gary Weiss's second film, and it's humorous maybe, but not funny. That's kind of his thing. Humorous, even touching, but usually not funny. I'm not sure I prefer it to Albert Brooks, but it's not as grating, certainly. Minor side note, I misspelled Gary Weiss's name in last week's film placard. There's another relatively famous Gary Weiss spelled with 2 S's, and it's an easy mistake to make. Sorry, Gary. This thing is pretty dang dark, and has O'Donoghue's prints all over it. Chevy rushes down a flight of stairs to answer a ringing phone, of course tripping and falling over the desk. He frantically picks up the receiver, answers suicide prevention hotline just in time to hear a gunshot, and then says,
Live from New York, it's Saturday night!
Alan Zweibel says of this sketch in Live from New York, the 10th show we ever did, Buck Henry was hosting. Lauren came by my desk and said, "You used to work in a deli, didn't you?" I said, "You name it, I sliced it." Lauren said, "You would be perfect to write Samurai Delicatessen." I said, "Sure." I had no idea what he was talking about. But I wrote Samurai Deli and all the other samurais after that. What started as that 1 2-minute sketch ended up being a franchise. He continues, "When I say I wrote all the samurais, what does that mean? It means I wrote all the stuff for Buck Henry or whoever did it that week, and then I go, John throws up a tomato and slices it, and John indicates in his gibberish, whatever, you know. I wrote no dialogue for John. The only time I wrote anything that looked like dialogue for him was when I had to indicate what the gibberish was meant to convey." As mentioned earlier, this is one of the first times they'd done recurring character sketches on SNL, aside from the land shark bits earlier this season. Buck Henry would go on to be the straight man in most of these samurai sketches, and they'd continue iterating on the same theme throughout Belushi's years on the show. Jane interviews Gilda, who plays a stereotypical sexpot bombshell, whom Jane is led to believe had an affair with President Kennedy. I think Lorraine might have been the more obvious choice here, but Gilda seems to have fun with it. James seems confused when Gilda mentions she still speaks to the president, Kennedy having been assassinated and all. And it then comes to light the president she'd actually slept with was Nixon. Jane immediately ends the interview. For what it's worth, Gilda says she hated every minute of it, but was promised she'd get to meet David Frost. In which Chevy takes dumb Ford to entirely new levels of idiocy. Buck plays the straight man and press secretary and future host Ron Nesson, and Chevy really turns the physical comedy up to maximum buffoonery. Hardly 10 seconds go by in this sketch without some fresh sight gag by Chase, and Buck just does the best he can to roll with it and keep setting Chase up. I love how Ford doesn't seem to notice his dog has been taxidermized, by the way. It's a really dumb gag, but I giggled at it more than I should have. Anyway, Nesson has the brilliant idea for everyone in Ford's orbit to be clumsy so as to make him look more normal, a plan he's dubbed Operation Stumblebump. From this point on, every silly thing Chevy does, Buck dutifully copies in a very matter-of-fact way. He's such a team player. This is one of the longest sketches so far, at almost 9 minutes. It overstays itself a bit, and probably could have been ended after the scene in the Oval Office before they cut to the press conference. However, it got the attention of folks in the Ford administration, and this sketch served as the genesis of one of the stranger events to take place in the first season. More on that later. Lorraine is great in this short advertisement for
the Evelyn Woodsky School of Speed Reading.
She's often best in short little bursts like this, where she finds every moment, as actors say. I adore this gag, and it's one that sticks out in my mind when I think of this episode, yet it's not something that you ever see on a greatest hits compilation or anniversary show. I wish Lorraine got more and better material. She's great. In the strange sequel to the classic Orson Welles film, we learn that Charles Foster Kane's last words were not in fact rosebud, but roast beef on rye with mustard. I won't try to work you through the tortured logic and bad French accents they used to get to that punchline, but trust me, it was a long way to go for a real groaner of a payoff. It was a supremely silly joke, yes, but a silly joke about a very sophisticated movie, Michael O'Donoghue liked to point out. He has a point. I can't imagine Laugh-In doing this kind of thing. Regardless, it's clear the whole endeavor was a labor of love for all involved. It was technically challenging getting all the camera cuts and stylized fades done in a live environment, and they had to fight with the director about the choice to air the sketch in black and white. Dave Wilson, the old drunk, feared folks would actually think their TVs were broken. It hadn't worked well in rehearsal, but reportedly the control room erupted in cheers and applause when they pulled it off for the live show. That's a great story. In this one, Gilda is a little girl begging for a bedtime story for Papa, who's an exhausted auto mechanic played by Danny. Aykroyd is absolutely fantastic in this one. Every single car reference and anecdote sounds believable, exactly like you'd hear from this kind of mechanic guy. Gilda is also adorable as the little tyke. I can't express enough how perfect and funny Danny is in this basically straight part. He's literally just being a gruff mechanic, but it's hilarious. I love this one. Chevy rolls a joint. Then he uses his belt to tie off his arm. Then he tries to push the joint into his vein, you know, like junkies do. Confused shrug. Tagline.
Why do you think they call it dope?
Scene. Brilliant. In which everyone in Buck's life uses literally every euphemism possible for poor Buck's constipation. This is totally a one-gag sketch, but Henry sells it with utter conviction, and again, I can imagine a fun time was had in the writing room coming up with all the endless hilarious ways to avoid saying the word constipation. Buck Henry is the king of playing it straight, by the way. I'd have definitely laughed at least some of these. Alrighty then. Buck says thanks to the cast, by the way they're all gay, and they should be treated with respect like everyone else. Belushi raised both eyebrows. I've no idea where that came from, but there you have it. As I mentioned, Buck Henry would become one of the go-to hosts during the first 5 years of the series, but he never appeared again after the original cast left the show. There were no hard feelings as far as I've read, but I suppose he felt the chemistry he'd had with those performers couldn't be recreated with a new group. We have lots more Buck to come though, so stay tuned.